What's going on, people? Welcome to United View and welcome to the Tactical View. Obviously, it is the international break, so there's no game to analyse this weekend. So instead, we'll be taking a look at Manchester United's summer signing from Real Madrid, Casemiro, who's already proven himself to be one of United's most important players. Now, with Casemiro, it's his defensive ability that is absolutely elite and better than anyone else in the world in his position, and this is going to be why. So without any further ado, let's get into the show. Now, before we take a look at Casemiro specifically, you've got to understand the way the team's set up and how his role can impact the rest of the team and the rest of the setup, particularly in the way we press. So, to start with, we'll have a little look at the way United set up in the press. And this is something that a lot of people have been talking about of late because in certain ways it does leave United quite exposed due to the way we set up, in particular in midfield. So, if Fulham are playing out from the back here, and they split the centre-backs like this, what we've seen from United pretty much throughout the season is that we start with this sort of hybrid pressing approach here, where we're asking the wingers to do two jobs. So if the fullbacks are really high and wide for Fulham, what we'll see from the wingers is they'll typically start fairly narrow opposite the centre-back. So what that gives us is a 3v3 situation here with the centre-backs and the goalkeeper opposite United's striker and the two wingers. Now, obviously, what that means is that at times you'll see the keeper is able to get the ball out to the opposite fullback if United have engaged the press on one side, and that means that there's a lot of recovery work to be done by the winger in terms of sprinting back when the press gets broken. But at times, obviously, the winger's not going to get back in time. So it's what happens then that can potentially throw the entire system into disarray, and that is where Casemiro becomes so important. So, in terms of the way the midfield set up then, so we've just covered the front three there, starting fairly narrow. In midfield, United will typically play with our two highest midfielders, so in recent times that might have been Bruno Fernandes and Fred, and they'll typically sit on the opposition's two deepest midfielders. And the way that leaves the rest of the team set up is that we'll have our fullbacks sitting on the wingers, we'll have one spare centre-back whilst the other one marks the striker, and that means that Casemiro, particularly if the opposition have got a number 10, is left in an interesting situation. So he's man for man with Pereira here to start with, since we played Fulham most recently, but that means that if the ball does get out down one side, Casemiro has to make a decision. Now, for most players, it's easy to sort of say on paper, if you're playing man-for-man in midfield, you follow your man the entire time and you cannot switch off. But really, that is the difference between the elite players and the ones that are just able to follow instructions and do a decent job for the team. The elite ones know the right moment at which you can switch off, go away from the man you're marking, and actually there's a bigger situation there, a bigger threat to deal with. So, to sort of show this in action, I've got a clip here prepared of Casemiro against Barcelona. So what you can see here is the United press. You can see it starts with Rashford sort of opposite Araujo there. You can see the midfield sort of pairing. You've got, I think that's Jadon Sancho there and Fred up on Frankie de Jong and Sergio Busquets. So you can see the eights really high up pressing. You've got Weghorst opposite the keeper. On the opposite side, you've got Antony opposite the other centre-back. And as we've said, what that leaves is if the fullback's really wide, really high, that leaves an area for a keeper to chip a ball over the press. So what you can see then, as Ter Stegen does exactly that, chips the ball over out to Jules Koundé on the right side, and you can see at this point here, just before that ball comes back inside, look at Casemiro here. He is tracking Frank Kessie. So he follows his run all the way, but at this moment here, he realises, he sees the danger, he sees that Koundé's got his head up, he's about to make that pass, and he steps away from Kessie. He lets him go, and he makes that decision there to step in, and he cuts off the pass to Lewandowski. That is what it is that he's got, which so many other players in that position haven't got, because they haven't got that ability to really sniff out the danger and recognise those situations. So, by way of comparison, we've got a fairly similar situation here, and we've got Scott McTominay in that role instead. So you see Tim Ream plays back to the goalkeeper. This time it's not a chip ball over the press, but again, you can see the similar setup, a similar structure. Bruno Fernandes is dealing with Palhinha, as you see. You'll see that a little bit more when the ball goes across. You've got Sabitzer on top of Pereira there. You've got Rashford on the right wing, dealing with Tim Ream. You've got Sancho on the opposite wing, dealing with the other centre-back there. And as the ball works its way out, obviously, look, in the first instance, that's not ideal from Jadon Sancho getting stepped like that by the centre-back. But when that ball goes out wide to the full-back, watch what happens here. McTominay sticks with his man the entire way, even though, from this situation, the danger that the midfielder there, Harrison Reed, is running in behind. That's a situation where possibly Casemiro would pass it on to Luke Shaw and let the rest of the midfielders behind deal with that situation, whilst he then deals with the ball carrier because he's got out of the press there. So you can see the difference. In that exact same situation, Casemiro was able to step away from his man, step in here and block the pass in field, whereas McTominay's followed his man all the way. Now, McTominay's not necessarily doing the wrong thing, because the idea in midfield is we set up man for man, but the importance is knowing what the situation is, being able to read it so that you're in the right place to win the ball back. And that's the biggest difference there between a player like McTominay, who hasn't necessarily done a bad thing in that situation, but against someone like Casemiro, who's done something brilliant in that situation. I think to illustrate the point further here, what we've got is, in terms of the way the United are most likely to get exposed in the press, it's against ball carriers. As we've seen in both of those situations, is when you get the fullback dribbling and running at pace down the side. And I mean, that's a structural issue of the way we press, with the wingers starting very narrow. It means there is space down the sides, so we are vulnerable to particularly fullbacks running down the sides, but also wingers and sometimes combination play in those wide areas. So to illustrate the sort of what we need from our defensive midfield player, this graph here, what you've got running along the bottom, you've got the number of challenges that the players attempted against dribbling players per 90. And on the other side, sort of going up, you've got the success rate. So what you can see in terms of both the amount of work rate he puts in and also his success rate in each one of those challenges, Casemiro is by far the best midfield player we've got. And that's one of the reasons we miss him so much when he's not there, and why we end up so vulnerable in those situations. Because McTominay obviously is putting in fewer challenges by a long way, and the success rate, to be fair to him, is quite good. It's just that he doesn't quite know when to make the right decision, whereas in contrast, you've got Fred here, who you can see he does get through a decent amount of defensive work, but you can call him a bit of a headless chicken because he's not very good at actually pulling it off. His success rate, almost 30% there, tackle success percentage, which is not great. Sabitzer, in terms of his success rate, again, he's doing a decent job. He's fairly successful, 50%. A little bit below Casemiro, about 56, 57. But again, he's not putting anywhere near the amount of work in. Now, obviously, Christian Eriksen's been missing for a long time, and you can see really defensively why actually in certain games we might be better off playing Fred, because both in terms of success rate and the amount of work he gets through, Eriksen isn't necessarily doing brilliantly there. So what we've seen is Casemiro's ability there to negotiate the right situation and know when to stick with his man and when he's actually better off dealing with the space in here and trying to intercept passes instead. And what he's so good at when he's doing that is seeing out the corner of his eye the run of Marcus Rashford, the winger, tracking back into position to follow the fullback. Because as the fullback slows down, because the rest of the players in front of him are marked man-to-man, as we see a lot in the United system, it's heavily man-to-man based, you can see when the winger's getting back into position, they're able to cut off some of the passing angles, which makes it a little bit easier for a player like Casemiro to read where the ball's going to end up next. Now, I want to come on now to a more general discussion about the way we press and why, again, Casemiro is so important, but also a flaw that does need addressing by Erik ten Hag. So what we see, as we've mentioned, is we start with our wingers really narrow, and what that can mean is that when that ball gets out to the fullback, we can be exposed. Now, a way that some teams deal with this sort of situation is the fullback will jump really early, so our left back will press the opposition right back, for example, and then the rest of the defence will shift round. However, for United, that's not something that we see happening too often. Instead, for whatever reason, our fullbacks seem really reluctant to jump, but if they do, we end up with a situation where if the striker here has pinned Martinez, he won't then go and deal with the winger instead. And what we sometimes end up with is a situation where the other centre-back is tucking all the way round, which means that there's no one to defend any balls into the box. So if the opposition are able to play some combinations there and get a ball into the box, there's a lot of space there and not enough United players defending. So it's an issue where some teams would see either the centre-backs tuck round, full-back tucks round as well, or you might see certain teams having the defensive midfielder dropping in to cover the space once the full-back's jumped. But that risks leaving an issue here in midfield, because with United's 8 starting high in the press, one of them has to drop in. For me, the way to solve this problem going forward is United need the opposite winger to work really hard on recovery and get back in so that the other midfielders can tuck into the centre and Casemiro can step into the back line. It's an issue which I think Erik ten Hag will need more training time to work on, because it's a lot of decisions to be made in really short time spans. But hopefully over the next sort of few months, maybe by the end of the season, we see a little bit of an improvement in that. That's enough about Casemiro in the press. We'll have a little discussion now, a little look at some clips of his general defensive qualities and his behaviour. In particular, his anticipation of the ball and where it's going to go before United have actually lost the ball. So in this situation, Casemiro starts here. He's near Frank Kessie, as that was his sort of main job in the Barcelona game. You've got United in possession there with Martinez on it. Gives that ball to Sancho. Great ball through the lines from Martinez, by the way. But Casemiro can tell at this point there is a high likelihood of Sancho losing the ball given that there's Barcelona players sort of converging around him. But here, the way he arcs his run, he disappears off shot for a second. But you see, as the ball is received by Koundé, from Koundé's body shape as he passes it, there is only really one area that ball can actually go to. And it's towards Cassier or maybe into the path of the run around the corner there. But you can see the way Casemiro, he changes his body shape, he angles that, and he's reacted before anybody else, moving quicker than anybody else, to shut that down straight away. And what you can see is that because of his aggressiveness, his sort of ability to get in there in front of Rafinha ends up making a bad pass because he's worried about getting clattered, and United win the ball back. So that's another little example there of the sorts of work Casemiro can get through. Now, in this one here against Real Betis, what I really like again is his intelligence in the press. So what you see is the ball gets knocked down, sort of a little bit loose in midfield. Casemiro anticipates where he's going, and yeah, he doesn't get there quite quickly enough, but he's sort of aware, he's sort of there enough to force the pass backwards. But it's what happens after that. He knows, having forced that player backwards, he knows that Carvalho is not going to be moving around the side. So he knows he's between the ball and Carvalho. So from that position, he doesn't have to stay there. He can go and press, knowing that he's taken him out of the game already, which is really nice because from that position, he triggers the press, gets Anthony involved as well, forces a long ball, and United are able to win back the ball. So another great example of Casemiro's general defensive qualities. What I want to come on to now is a little look at his in-possession qualities and what he's able to do with the ball at his feet. So I think it's something that's often overlooked with Casemiro is the way he's able to play long balls. He's able to sort of find good through balls into the channels, find the wingers in behind very often. So by way of comparison here in terms of statistics, what you can see actually is Casemiro, apart from Christian Eriksen, Casemiro is United's leading long passer in midfield. In terms of the amount of switches of play, he's on a pretty similar level to Sabitzer, but in terms of long passes overall, he gets a lot more of those done. And you can see from sort of his role in the team, the way the team's set up, that we are geared to allow him to do that. So looking at Casemiro in possession, what you can see is that when he's got space and time, he's got a fantastic range of passing and brilliant vision. For example, here he puts in a great cross with the outside of his foot, comes back to Bruno, again, space and time there, puts in an outside foot cross on the half volley. Fantastic there, great example. And another one here, what you can see is that when he gets space and time, he's able to find balls into the channels and particularly in behind for the wingers. And in terms of through balls, Casemiro is actually our best performing midfielder in terms of pulling those off, mainly through passes like this, where he finds Pellistri. Now, what you've seen from United in the way that we've set up in recent weeks is that Ten Hag has geared the midfield setup a lot more to the way we're trying to play there with Casemiro, and a lot more to Casemiro's strengths. So what we've seen is that earlier in the season, rather than we had a little bit more of a double pivot with Eriksen and Casemiro, now what we see when we're building up is that we have Bruno coming wide one side and the 8 on the other side, whether that's Sabitzer, Sancho or Fred, going wide on the other side. So what you see is that we tend to build up more with wide combinations down either side. So the wingers will stay high and fairly central, and we'll build up with Wan-Bissaka and Bruno Fernandes dropping in late to combine and play out that way. And what that does is it has the effect of drawing pressure in from the opposite side. So typically in that situation, we'll see the opposition's fullback push up, we'll see the winger get attracted by Wan-Bissaka, and probably one of the midfielders as well. And what that means then is that if we're able to switch the ball, there's space on the opposite side, but also it means that Casemiro is more likely to be in a space in the centre of the park, which means he's less likely to be taking the ball under pressure, where he's prone to giving it away, and more likely to be able to take it when he's got space and time. And then, because the wingers are in high and central positions, he can find those balls over the top that he's so good at doing towards Marcus Rashford. So the change in setup there from Ten Hag, going from a double pivot to having a single pivot now, and also focusing a lot more of our build-up on the wide spaces rather than trying to play through the centre, is again geared towards Casemiro's strength because he's so good at doing that. So as much as we say, obviously, the defensive impact of something we really miss with Casemiro when he's not there, you can see the in-possession stuff is something that's just as important and we miss just as much when he's not there again because we've set the team up for the way he plays. The other thing with Casemiro that we really miss when he's not there is that he always wants the ball. So take a look at Scott McTominay in this clip here. You've got Harry Maguire on the ball. Watch McTominay's run. So you can see as that ball goes out to Marcus Rashford, Casemiro is going to be a little bit deeper, a little bit shallower to make that angle more easily available to Marcus Rashford, so he can just bounce the ball back, and then Casemiro would likely play a long switch out to the opposite side. McTominay, by contrast here, is very flat to the ball, very shallow, meaning that Rashford's basically got an impossible job to pass that ball back inside. But also it means that where Casemiro would be able to give that angle, it also means he's perfectly positioned for the defensive side, whereas McTominay being too shallow means that actually he's got to try and he's got a lost cause really in terms of trying to keep up with Andreas Pereira, because he's given him a 2-3 yard head start already for that ball to go in. So you can see there the difference between Casemiro and McTominay in terms of the angles they make, but also because he's making a better angle, Casemiro will be in a better position to track the run of Pereira and stop that sort of chance being able to happen. So McTominay's, again, it's a frustrating part of his game where he doesn't quite position himself well enough to receive the ball, but then also in that situation he's just so slow to react. He doesn't see the danger in this situation, hasn't scanned, and by the time he turns around he realises, hang on, he's already away. So that's another area where we miss Casemiro. Now the final thing I want to come on to is a little bit of sloppiness that we can see from Casemiro. So in this situation here from the Betis game, Malacia gets the ball off De Gea and he rolls that ball into Casemiro midfield. Good pass, to be fair to him, to play that in. What I want to highlight first of all though is the space that's created behind the double pivot here. So if you look at the Betis double pivot, because United have got we've got Casemiro and Bruno both sitting fairly deep, look how much space we've created there in midfield because of that. And that's why earlier in the season Ten Hag was so keen to have a double pivot there, because you can create that space for your forwards to drop into, for your wingers to tuck into if they come a little bit narrower, and that can be crucial in terms of breaking down defences. The issue though is that because this creates a zone of intense pressure, you've got two Betis players right next to Casemiro and Bruno, it means they've got to be able to take the ball on the half turn and move that ball on immediately. There's no time for extra touches, no time for mucking about. You have to move the ball quickly, and that's the situation where Casemiro isn't quite as good. He's not quite as able to scan and play those balls on the half turn as someone like Christian Eriksen or possibly some of the players he played with at Madrid, Modric and Toni Kroos. So that's why you end up seeing things like in this situation where he ends up losing the ball. So as that comes in from Malacia, again, look, he's had a little look, hasn't noticed that Betis player there where players with probably slightly better vision would. Christian Eriksen probably would. He ends up giving the ball away. So that's the sort of sloppiness that you can see from time to time with Casemiro, and that's why Ten Hag's changed the system to ensure that that sort of situation where he's under intense pressure doesn't happen. And that is why it's so important that United sign somebody in the summer that is able to be press resistant, but able to carry the ball up the pitch, so that in that situation, if they need to, if they are under intense pressure, they might be able to dribble their way out. They've got a different tool set to what we've got currently in the squad. And with that in mind, a little look here at sort of the ball progression, where it comes from in the United midfield. And what you can see is that in terms of progressive passing, we've got a lot of players that do a decent enough job. Eriksen does a decent amount of progressive passing volume. Same with Sabitzer, he's doing really well at the moment, and Casemiro. But in terms of ball carrying, we haven't really got anybody that excels at the moment. No one's classing Christian Eriksen as a world-class ball carrier. And in terms of how high up the graph that he is, that's the carries. He's on a similar level to Scott McTominay, who again, probably his biggest strength is ball carrying, because he's, well, look at the passing, he's nowhere near the numbers everyone else is putting up. But this is why it's so important that United sign in the summer somebody that is able to complement Casemiro's abilities by having a fantastic ball carrying ability and more press resistance. That's all for today. Hope you enjoyed the show. Let me know your thoughts on the show and Casemiro down below, and we'll see you again next week for another Tactical View.